Welcome to Willow Oak's Value Hour. I'm Jessica Greer, Vice President of Willow Oak Asset Management, and today I am so pleased to have Patrick Dominguez here to talk through some compliance matters that should be considered by managers, large and small. So by way of introduction, Patrick is the Director of Investment Advisor Services with Gordian Compliance Solutions. In this role, Patrick helps SEC and state-registered clients establish and monitor compliance programs, everything from drafting a firm's policies and procedures and managing regulatory filings to conducting mock regulatory exams and reviewing a firm's marketing materials for compliance purposes. And as an external compliance consultant for Willow Oak, Patrick provides valuable guidance on a regular basis on the ever-changing regulatory landscape as we manage the compliance programs for our affiliated firms. So Patrick, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me on. Great to be here.
Absolutely. I'm really looking forward to getting into what I'm sure will be the first of numerous conversations, as we've already kind of discussed offline. So, all right, well, to get us started, Willow Oak recently released an article making the case for emerging managers to develop and adopt comprehensive compliance programs sooner rather than later. Some of the points that I made in the article were that a defined compliance program really helps us avoid developing bad habits when it comes to best practices around document retention, archiving communications with investors, and meeting filing requirements. And while emerging managers might not be required to do certain things in the early stages of launching and managing their fund, not building sound operations and practices from a compliance standpoint can really cost you in the longer term when it comes to de-risking the operations of your business and ultimately attracting capital, especially institutional capital. So, Patrick, given your experience, what advice would you give to an emerging manager as it relates to compliance generally?
Sure, and I think first, when speaking today about emerging managers, we'll address compliance that applies to exempt reporting advisors, and those advisors not required to register, perhaps due to individual state laws or asset levels. Some of this might be applicable to registrants as well. But the first and most important point for us is that regardless of any strict regulatory requirements for particular policy areas, emerging managers still have a fiduciary duty to their clients. So any practices that are less than forthcoming and honest or represent anything other than full and fair disclosure of material facts and risks would be a violation of that duty. And as a result, as you said, emerging managers often maintain some kind of compliance program that addresses the topics that might face their advisory businesses.
Absolutely.
Some of those topics, I think we've discussed before, anti-fraud requirements of the Advisors Act, for example, which address that fiduciary duty generally and can include policies and procedures necessary to review marketing materials and regulatory filings for disclosure or to ensure fair allocation of investment opportunities for clients. Another might be pay-to-play, which prohibits certain investment advisor personnel from engaging in political pay-to-play practices through contributing to government officials who may direct government entity investments. There is anti-money laundering. Many managers delegate AML programs to fund administrators or custodians, but due to increased counterparty risk, these firms often require an investment advisor to maintain their own AML program, even if just to identify those services offered by the vendor. And then, finally, there's record keeping, examinations, proxy voting, which constitute a large gray area. Emerging managers that anticipate future registration should certainly consider the applicability of those topics. And even if not considering future registration, should determine if it's in the best interest of their clients to address those areas. One big topic is the protection of investor privacy, which would require a manager to identify any reasonably foreseeable risks to the security, confidentiality, and integrity of customer information. Up to date and everything is patched appropriately, or maybe you're having trouble with a vendor that's providing a service that you need to repair in order to have the best information security program possible. And this can be delegated to third-party firms, whether IT firms or other due diligence firms. And it can be managed by limiting the types and quantities of data stored by the firm, particularly non-public personal information about its clients or investors, and any non-public trading data for the portfolio. There are some other regular updates as well that emerging managers might want to keep in mind. Exempt reporting advisors are usually private fund managers, so you do want to remember that your funds might have Form D filings to submit, as well as blue sky filings for states in which you have investors. You might want to review disclosures in your marketing and offering documents no less than annually for accuracy. You may need a bad actor questionnaire for your employees and for sizable limited partners in your funds in order to adhere to Rule 506D of Regulation D, which is the exemption upon which your private funds will rely. And also consider vendor due diligence, which goes hand in hand with protecting investor privacy, particularly those firms that are essential to your provision of advisory services to your clients. You want to ensure that they have steps in place for business continuity and protecting customer information.
Yeah, business continuity, that's a big issue right now, obviously, in the post or current COVID world, right?
Absolutely. And then finally, you might be wondering what we would do with 5 to 7 topic areas, especially as your firm grows and you add more employees. Even if not strictly required for your registration status, a compliance manual and code of ethics that addresses these topics and any identified advisory business risks would be highly recommended. And if you do establish these policies and procedures, plan to review them at least annually for effectiveness. And most importantly, and this sounds a little funny, but follow them. If you do make policies and procedures, it's very important to actually adhere to them and take them seriously. The SEC expects that you would, and that's the entire point of having a manual for your firm.
Oh, absolutely. I think we often see, and I think you and I have talked about this, that a lot of managers who are not required to register because they're not running managed accounts, they're not registered investment advisors within a state, and you know their assets under management fall under that threshold that you've addressed. They maybe think that because they have their PPM and their formation documents for the private partnership in place, that's kind of it. That's all they need. And I've been astonished to see how many individuals might not necessarily know everything that's being documented. So like you said, if you have things documented, you know what standards you're being held to and follow them. And that's a really, really key piece I've found, certainly in my interactions with managers.
Oh, absolutely.
So in your experience as well, are there any operational red flags that you've kind of come across that you can point to maybe as cautionaries for an early stage manager, or any stage for that matter?
Certainly. Some compliance obligations may not be strictly required, but best practices in a firm's fiduciary duty may indicate otherwise. Custody is a perfect example. The custody rule, when you read it, does not strictly apply to unregistered investment advisors, but safeguarding client assets is paramount to an advisor's fiduciary duty. Fund managers in particular may shy away from the cost of the annual audit, but these will be required upon registration, and many investors in private funds do expect them to be audited. So it is the best way for an advisor to demonstrate adherence to those safeguarding practices. And then also understand what services your providers offer and identify any potential gaps. So by way of another example, many fund managers use Securities Counsel as a one-stop shop for fund formation, constituent offering and subscription documents, regulatory filings, and compliance consulting. And there are many firms out there, compliance consulting firms, that can pick up slack on regulatory filings that may be able to help you save on your expenses as you grow.
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the services that Gordian provides to all of our Willow Oak affiliates, and it's great. And you know, on that point, to be quite frank, I didn't even know that an annual audit was even optional. I think maybe it's treated more as a given, and as you said, certainly when it comes to being registered, it's mandatory. But I didn't know in an earlier stage that it is optional. So.
The rule itself does not strictly speak to an unregistered investment advisor, but I think 9 times out of 10, and probably greater than that, most individuals in the space would tell you, get the audit.
Yeah. That's just one of the best practices. Yeah, absolutely. So can you walk us through some requirements that emerging managers need to be aware of in both the short and the longer term as they continue to grow their firms?
Sure. Keep your regulatory assets under management in mind and understand triggers that may require registration or invalidate your exemption from registration. So you do really need to look ahead and think about either that 100 million mark, if you're thinking about SEC registration at some point, maybe your state has a particular limit, or if you bring on a separately managed account where you were only managing private funds before, that could invalidate an exempt reporting advisor filing.
Got it.
Some other regulatory filings will trigger upon that 100 million under management mark, but others like Schedule 13 DNG, which is the 5% beneficial ownership form, or the 13H large trader filing may be required based on your portfolio holdings or trading activity. So again, consulting either with counsel or with a consultant like Gordian would be helpful in order to identify where those triggers might be. And finally, join the SEC, the securities law firm, and the compliance consulting email lists. These lists often circulate compliance calendars for the upcoming quarter, which might prompt you to think about something that you haven't considered before. It also might highlight hot topics that might apply to your advisory business. So as those are coming up, as the SEC is thinking about them, even if your firm was not examined, you might be in practice of something another firm was doing. A hot topic right now is alternative data, things like web scraping, credit card panels, satellite imagery of parking lots for malls. This type of data is something that the SEC is now digging into. And so a number of our clients have been engaged in different types of research and have found all of the notes coming out from the SEC on that very helpful for designing their own policies.
That's great. Yeah, we kind of treat that as like a filling in the gaps type of, stay on top of it so you can kind of fill your gaps as you continue to grow. On that, I was recently reading about some of the top compliance topics most frequently flagged in deficiency letters, in particular from the SEC and OC, the books and records rule, custody rule, compliance rule, regulatory rule, and then code of ethics. Can you give us kind of the cliff notes on these and how to stay on the right side of these from a regulatory perspective?
Yes, first, definitely review those risk alerts. We're recording this today on Friday, November 20th. The SEC just released one on November 19th around the compliance rule, which we have not fully digested yet, but is equally helpful and provides a lot of insight to what the SEC is seeing on the ground. Most managers will identify those deficiencies that you just listed out from that risk alert are really easy wins for a compliance program. The books and records rule, maintaining and following a code of ethics and compliance manual, and knowing your firm's custody situation. These are deficiencies that are general in nature. They apply to most advisors. So there is an absolute wealth of knowledge on addressing any of those perceived gaps in your programs, whether that needs to be an operational item you add in, or even just a policy and procedure change you make during your annual review process.
And you just highlighted why relationships like we have with Gordian are so important, because you guys are tracking, on the regular basis, any new insights and risks and warnings coming out from the SEC. So that's great. Well, Patrick, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. As I mentioned, Gordian has been an invaluable partner to Willow Oak as we build comprehensive compliance programs and sound operations for our firm partners. We look forward to continuing this conversation and sharing insights on future episodes. For more information on compliance and operational best practices, please don't forget to visit our resource center at willowoakfunds.com. And until next time, thank you so much for joining us.